panels of senior project, history, research, senior projects. The second panel, like the first, is a coherent whole. So if you can stay for the whole 50 minutes, you'll hear 3 papers in a row, and then the panelists will have a chance to come down to the front and answer questions. So hopefully you can stay for the full 50 minutes. Each of the panelists will have 10 minutes to talk. I'll introduce them briefly, so save those questions for the question and answer session. The name of our panel, the second panel today, is Roosevelt's America. There are, by the way, programs there when you come to get food. You can see the different papers and the panel titles. Roosevelt's America with a K. Okay, that's the name. That's the title of the panel. Political Religion, Enemy Aliens, and War Crimes in the Pacific. And our first panelist, Patrick Cohn, is like our next panelist. You see how different panels have different personalities. A double major in history and political science, and you'll see that in this panel in the first 2 papers, and to some extent in the third paper, who combines the two. And Patrick's from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and he wants to either teach or more likely go to law school, but he will be doing a kind of summer camp for youth in Missouri in this summer. So, you'll also see that as we get to the contemporary period, there's more interest in law school and teaching, but that's just an interesting observation. Good. So, the title of Patrick's paper is Nothing to Fear But Fear Itself. That you all know. What you don't know is that Franklin Roosevelt ran his regime according to the theory of political religion. Mm-hmm. So,
well, now that I said that, I'm done. So, if you're wondering why I'm standing over here, I noticed while I was sitting down that every about minute I was looking at the food. So I thought, if anybody's not paying attention, at least you're looking over here. Hopefully that works. So my name is Patrick Henry Cohn, and I am about to present to you about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the theory of political religion. Fancy. Historiography. So first I'm going to tell you guys kind of like why I picked the topic question, and so on. Let's go with the question. So, can the theory of political religion, which has previously been applied to Adolf Hitler's leadership, be applied to the American context under the leadership of Franklin D. Roosevelt, recognizing the many similarities shared between Hitler and Roosevelt's governments? So, it's kind of a large question. I better unpack it before I have too many questions. So the first thing I'm going to unpack is kind of similarity. So I wanted to do this topic because I noticed there's some big things that FDR and Hitler had in common. So first of all, they came to power both mainly, well, I won't say mainly, one of the main causes was because of the economy. We all know, the Great Depression, why did it happen? Way to go U.S., kind of all destructive. But that was one similarity. They both came because they were looking for somebody that could get them out of this crisis. The second thing is they both actually, ironically, were in power at the exact same time period. This is crazy. 1933 to 1945, both. So they came into power in 1933, like I said, because of economic causes. In 1945, they both left power, unfortunately, because both died for different reasons. So they both were in, yeah. So people in history know why they died. So one was the Fuhrer, one was the president, kind of important positions. Last 2 things is, on the flip side, they also restored the economy. So I think it's funny that there's also similar names. So with Adolf Hitler, it was the New Order, while with FDR, it was the New Deal, kind of putting a spin on it. Way to go, FDR. And then lastly, they both were in the highest ranking position for World War II. So we're talking about Hitler, he was the highest ranking military leader, and then FDR, and this is not working, fabulous. Nice, perfect. And so then FDR was the highest ranking civilian leader. Now, if you have any wondering, any preponderance why I picked this topic, so I love World War II, and I just thought that Hitler and FDR are fascinating, but we can learn so much from, I would say, potentially the 2 most important leaders in world history. Nice. So you're probably wondering to yourself, what the heck is political religion? Me too. I thought the same thing. Well, Eric Vogelin, who was a German-born political philosopher, he talks about Well, he had this mindset. He's like, okay, why is it that Hitler, who was basically nothing at some point, not only became a something, but gained so much power that everybody followed him, and what you're about to understand in a second is worship him. So he came up with this book called Political Religions in 1938, and he theorized. He's like, okay, there's secular governments, there's secular leaders of those governments. I believe in the contents of Hitler in the totalitarian state. I believe that Hitler was raised beyond just, okay, he's a leader. He was raised to such an elevation to where it's like, man, he's like a religion. So it goes from secular to sacred, political religions. Oh, it worked, nice. So now you're wondering, all right, well, where's the debate? I wondered the same thing. And actually, I read so many secondary sources, I was beginning to wonder, where is political religion in FDR? The catch is there isn't anything. So maybe a publication someday will make it famous, I don't know. But, so here's the thing, is there's people that see FDR, they see him as a socialist. They argue like, okay, everything that he did, wow. A lot of people in America wouldn't like that, socialism, right? And then there's those that are like, no, he was the defender of democracy. Everything he did helped. Well, what I found out is, as I was reading a lot of secondary sources, so much where it almost broke my back as I was going back to my room, was that they're actually basically implicitly talking about political religion. So, like a couple examples of this would be, as a socialist, they say, okay, the Blue Eagle campaign. They talk about lack of showing him as a polio victim, social reforms, and all these, which you'll understand in a second, are aspects when I talk about it of political religion. Then on the other side, the defender of democracy, so there's unemployment programs, there's the fireside chats, there's campaign rallies, and these things are like, wow, you know, he really defended democracy, and what they didn't know at the time, as they were talking about it, is they're really helping my argument. So, now, before I get to the findings, let's talk about a little bit about my paper, which some people didn't like to read because it was really long. Okay, so I judged it by 5 components. And so it was organized thematically. So the first one is values, second one is purpose, third one is symbols, superhuman, and emotion. And if you're wondering, did he come up with it by himself? No, I do not have a master's nor a PhD, I'm not that smart. But Vogelin, Gentile, Burley, Meyer, and Gontier are just a couple of examples of many that I've looked at to where they talk about this. And so if you're wondering, all right, what does that even mean? So values is, there's a situation where Hitler is talked about, and they say we believe in the blood, we believe in the Fuhrer. And what this basically means is we value him as a leader, and so they value it, as you can imagine, so much where it's like a religion. For instance, the Apostles' Creed, I believe in God the Father, so on and so forth. Purpose. So he wrote Mein Kampf. If you don't know what that is, it's his biography. It's really long, being on a summation. But basically, he tells the people, this is what I think. And not only did they buy into it, but they applied it, raising him up again. Symbols. So you guys have probably heard of the swastika. You've probably seen the eagle. The Totenkopf, if you don't know what that is, and I probably said it wrong, and we have 2 people that know how to speak German here. Oh well. But it's the crossbones and the skull that was on the SS uniforms. And so, again, this symbol, like, people looked at Hitler and they're like, man, he's something more, and they followed him. And then the last 2, so superhuman, it's not exactly the term that they use, but it's the term that I came up with. They looked at him as almost a demigod. And so if you've ever seen Triumphant Will, or even a clip, as you watch it, it's like, wow, here comes this demigod, and he's amazing. And everybody's following him, armies. And then lastly, emotion, political liturgy. So there was literally public worship of the Fuhrer. So now talking about what I read. So mountains of primary sources are in FDR, and just briefly a couple, like I talked about acts of Congress, the NIRA, National Industrial Recovery Act, and the NRA, National Recovery Administration, books, so Mein Kampf, Nothing to Fear, which was about that big, it was really heavy, and it had a million things on FDR. Films, so you got NRA films, campaign films, newspapers. I love how Stetson Library has a million things in the New York Times and Washington Post. Political rallies, we got the Green Pastures Rally of many, but that's one I focused on. Presidential elections, I focused on one in particular. I looked at the results of it. And then speeches, of course. This is the juicy part, so get ready. So, values. You guys left me Okay, 1932 political rally in Chicago. 200,000 people showed up. This is one of his first political rallies. I don't know if we can even gauge that because we live in little DeLand, but that's enormous. And like they did spectacles, they did nightlights. It was amazing. He's not even president yet, and that is just one example how they put a value. Oh, nice. How they put a value on 1945. New York Times with many examples. The Creed for America. There's a list, and literally it was like 2 pages long of creeds that he made that people put value in. Purpose, 1932, Democratic Convention. He says that he wanted to do a crusade to restore America to its own people. People bought into that for 4 terms, 2 more than any other president. They saw his purpose and followed it. And then also with purpose, he had people under him, like Archibald MacLeish. If you don't know who that is, he was the director of one of the War Department's part, which was called the Facts and Figures. That's right. But basically the point is if you look at Joseph Goebbels, propaganda minister, and Hitler's Nazi Germany, they both promoted propaganda. And by MacLeish, there was purpose given and people bought into it, no matter what he said. Moving to symbols, I talked briefly about the Blue Eagle campaign, and basically more or less, if you followed certain standards, your company, you would get this wonderful, nice poster that had a blue eagle and it said, "We do our part." Well, guess what? It wasn't supposed to be mandatory, but people did it anyways because they believed in him. Superhuman. So I talked briefly about The Triumph of Will. That was that film. Well, guess what? FDR's got him too. So there's millions of films out there. And like you look at FDR, and he's a Poliak. You know, he shouldn't be looking like a stud. Well, he was looking like a real stud in these films. So they lifted him up there too. That's definitely an academic term. And lastly, emotion. In 1936, the Green Passage Rally, I think, is a perfect example. This is now in his, right about to be his 2nd term. 7 states, governors come, promote all their people to come. There's so many people, the stadium is packed. I have a picture in my paper, and the emotion was crazy. So that public worship is seen in just this one rally, but in all the rallies where they literally, you would think they were going to church and worshiping God. So in the end, I'm not going to argue. I didn't argue in my paper saying he was a socialist, nor did I argue that he was the defender of democracy. That would probably have been easier, but we took this theory of political religion, and the fact of the matter is, I conclude, if you look at any one of those 5 categories, you see throughout in millions of primary sources, so much to where I literally was bogged down every week and I couldn't find any more because I was just about to die. You get the conclusion when you read this that Hitler's leadership was defined by political religion, and now we can say FDR was as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, very much. Well done. Very entertaining. First panel, set the bar pretty high. Good. So our second panelist on the 2nd panel, Shane Smith, is also a history and political science major who grew up in Longwood, Florida. Now lives in Sorrento, Florida. There's so many Italian cities in Florida. He is also thinking of attending law school after graduating. And his paper, while the content and focus has remained the same, the title has changed, as many people's titles have, and it's now Enemy Aliens, the Role of Race in the U.S. and British Internment Policy during the Second World War. Shane, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone, my name is Shane Smith, and I compared and contrasted U.S. and British internment policy during the Second World War. Specifically, my paper sought to better understand the development of the anti-analyst climate in the U.S. and Britain, and why Germans and Italians did not receive as much fear and scrutiny in the United States as they did in the British case. I argued that although racism is cited as one of the most prominent factors by historians in the internment of enemy aliens in both the U.S. and British cases, it was due to a variety of factors such as fear of espionage, racism, and pressures of war. Although racism played a major role in the structure of internment, other factors, specifically pressures of war and the threat of invasion, served as a greater driving force in the passing of internment policies. I chose these two cases for comparison for several reasons. For example, both the U.S. and British governments adopted a policy of internment for enemy aliens issued under the justification of military necessity. Additionally, both the United States and Britain were on the Allied side during the war and shared a common language. Further, both these nations have a democratic system of government. However, some differences exist. Britain faced greater pressures from the war and threat of being invaded than the U.S. being located in Europe. Also, the British had a prior history of internment, having enacted a policy of internment during the First World War. Nevertheless, while both the United States and Britain are liberal democracies whose founding documents promise rights to their citizens, these governments still enacted internment policies that impeded on the rights of citizens. In both cases, the resulting internment camps held perceived enemy peoples. Consequently, many factors contributed to the enactment of internment policy in the U.S. and British cases. One of the primary reasons argued by many historians has been racism, but racism alone does not sufficiently explain internment. Other factors needed to be identified in order to gain a better understanding of this point in history. Numerous historiographical debates exist regarding the factors that led to the use of internment in the U.S. case. Otis L. Graham argued that fear of espionage and sabotage arising out of the attack of Pearl Harbor, as well as the influence of pop culture, specifically American media, served as a major driving force in bringing about Japanese-American internment. However, Justin Ewers pointed out that FDR's intelligence network informed him that Japanese-American community was in fact loyal. However, Lieutenant General John DeWitt fiercely claimed that Japanese-born immigrants could not be trusted. DeWitt was not alone in these claims. In fact, the entire political establishment of the Western United States, from governors to congressmen to even law enforcement, pushed for the evacuation of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. As a result, Ewers concluded that Japanese Americans' internment occurred due to war hysteria and racial prejudice of the day. Numerous other historians point towards racism in explaining the internment of Japanese Americans. For example, Roger Daniels in Concentration Camp USA stated, if active racism of the West Coast was the initial catalyst for the evacuation, the more passive national racist climate for the precondition for its acceptance, it was racism of the Intermountain West which was the final determinant of WRA policy, which is the War Relocation Authority. Various historiographical debates also surround British internment. Lucio Sponza stated that Churchill initiated the internment of Italian immigrants in Britain in response to Italy entering the war on the side of the Axis. However, Sponza goes on to state, to some extent, a persistent anti-Italian attitude was a contributory factor in Britain. However, additionally, Louis Burleston in the state internment and public criticism in the Second World War points out that as Britain was threatened with invasion, the general public and security services demanded mass internment. Thus, pressures of war cannot be negated as an important factor. However, Burleston also mentioned Sir Neville Bland, the British minister to the Dutch government, who had broadcasted that enemy groups within Holland had undermined its national security. Consequently, no German, Austrian, nor anyone connected to them could be trusted. Thus, racism and the internment of enemy aliens remains prominent. I used various primary sources throughout my paper to support what was being stated, including U.S. newspapers such as the New York Times and British photojournalistic magazines such as the Picture Post. Additionally, I supported my papers with various memoirs from people who lived through this period in history. One such memoir was Monica Sohn's Nisei Daughter, which recounts Sohn's experience of being interned at a Japanese-American internment camp and various acts of racism she experienced during the wartime period. Additionally, I used Mark Linton's Accidental Journey, which recovers his experience of becoming an active member of British society by teaching at the prestigious Cambridge University, then becoming interned during the war. Finally, some government documents were used, such as Executive Order 9066, which ordered the internment of Japanese Americans on the west coast of the United States, and General John DeWitt's final report, which discussed the evacuation program from Japanese Americans. Although these primary sources did not differ much from previous sources on the topic, I've used these sources to bring about different findings and a different viewpoint. In organizing my paper, I took a thematic approach rather than a chronological approach due to the time difference in which both the U.S. and Britain enacted their internment policies. It was not until after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, that the U.S. formally entered the war. At this point in time, the war had been raging in Europe since 1939. I pointed towards three major factors in the development of the anti-alienist climate in the U.S. and British cases. Specifically, the role of the media, fear of espionage, specifically national security, and racism. Although this is not a complete list, I feel it points to three of the most prominent factors in bringing about the anti-alienist climate in the U.S. and British cases that subsequently led to the policy of internment to deal with these perceived enemy aliens. I went on to argue that as some historians believe that racism is the primary factor in bringing about internment, pressure of war, for example, likely created a bigger impact. For instance, in the U.S. case, following the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, many Americans on the West Coast believed that the U.S. mainland would be attacked next. Rumors of Japanese espionage in the attack on Pearl Harbor created much alarm among Americans that helped to get an internment policy passed in order to contain the perceived Japanese-American threat. To counter this argument, one may argue, why then were Germans and Italians not placed in internment camps like Japanese Americans? Many Americans reported seeing German U-boats off the east coast of the United States. Why then were they not treated in the same manner as Japanese Americans? Firstly, Germans and Italians were interned in the United States during the Second World War. However, it was to a far lesser degree. I still contend that other factors, specifically the pressures of war, served as a greater driving force in the passing of internment policy. However, racism played a large part in the structure of internment policy. Additionally, the historian Fox stated that it was due in large part to the assimilation of German and Italian immigrants and their assimilation to U.S. society, and concerns over an additional internment would create too much alarm throughout and disagreement among U.S. citizens. Thus, to retain popular support for the war, they did not go about interning Germans and Italians. Additionally, racism has been a recurring factor throughout U.S. history. However, it was not until the U.S. was faced with the potential threat of invasion by Japan that internment policy was enacted. This further supports my argument that pressures of war, specifically the threat of invasion, served as a primary driving force in internment policy. The role of pressures of war in bringing about internment policy can also be seen in the British case. Britain was under imminent threat of being invaded by German troops following France's surrender and Britain's retreat at Dunkirk. In order to help contain the perceived threat of enemy aliens within Britain's borders, the British government enacted a policy of internment similar to that enacted in the First World War. They enacted a similar policy of the First World War. However, during the Second World War, this policy was not as far lasting. During the First World War, the policy lasted throughout the whole war. However, during the Second World War, it only lasted around a year and a half due to popular support turning against the internment policy and thus being taken out. Further, the reactionary nature of British internment policy can be seen in the passing of internment policy towards Italians. Winston Churchill initiated the internment of Italian immigrants in Britain in response to Italy entering the war on the side of the Axis on June 10, 1940. Although anti-German and anti-Italian attitudes existed in Britain prior to the internment policy's enactment, it was not until Britain was faced with the clear threat of Italy and their joining on the side of the Axis that internment policy was actually enforced. As a result of the points I argue, I would suggest a change in the way historians view why internment policy came about in both the U.S. and British cases. Racism alone is not sufficient in explaining the passing of internment policies. Other factors, such as media, fear of espionage, and especially pressures of war and threat of invasion, served as a greater driving force in bringing about internment policy in the U.S. and British cases.
So our third panelist in Roosevelt's America with the K is Chris Mitchell. Chris is from the land and has, I think, a peanut gallery for that reason.
Yeah, very peanut.
Which is good. He's a history major with a humanities minor, and he would like to move to New York City in the spring, because he's going to graduate in December, right? Yes. That's why we're worried about the culture credits, but he's going to get lots of culture credits after December because he wants to work in a museum or art gallery and then apply to graduate school. So and moving to New York City is a great call for itself. The title of Chris's paper is Ordinary Men in War. Did you add that? In a War Without Mercy, right. American War Crimes in Comparative Context. So, Chris, what will we do?
So, like you said, my name is Chris Mitchell, and my presentation is Ordinary Men in a War Without Mercy, or in a War Without Mercy, American War Crimes in Comparative Context. So the question that I try to answer is, in terms of perpetrator motivations, how did the atrocities committed by the American soldiers against the Japanese soldiers compared to those by the German soldiers against the Jews? And by American soldiers, or American atrocities, I'm referring to the treatment of Japanese soldiers during the Pacific War from late 1941 to 1945. And these included the fact that some American soldiers didn't take Japanese soldiers prisoners. They would either execute them or they just avoided taking them at all. And in some cases, they actually would decapitate their heads and boil them to make them white and then send them back home. And then they would also collect their gold teeth and then carve down their bones and make them into utensils. So I chose this particular question and topic because, for one, war is written by the victors. I didn't really know about really a lot of this sort of angle from the Pacific War or even World War II, and I kind of have a lot of interest in World War II, so it kind of struck me as odd that I didn't know. But being that America won the war, it kind of makes sense. So that's kind of why I kind of stuck with that idiom of war is written by the victors. I want to focus also on some of the motivations by the Nazi soldiers as well, just because that is something that was looked at throughout the Second World War. Usually when you think of the Second World War, you think of the Holocaust. So I wanted to kind of use that as a comparison to compare to why the motivations happened with the American soldiers. So my initial thesis is that the soldiers' behaviors and the atrocities were the result of some event or a series of events, which in some cases is entirely true, but I think the major conclusion of the paper so far is what transpired in the Philippines at the beginning of the Pacific War, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. So the historiography, or the arguments by other historians, I'm not going to talk about all of these, but one in particular is Craig Cameron. But a lot of what the authors talk about, they talk a lot about racism, either prior to the Second World War or even during the Second World War, and how that actually impacted the way the soldiers behaved throughout the Pacific War. So Craig Cameron saw that racism was one of the main catalysts on Laylu, but he also speculated that certain events, like the ambush of an American group of soldiers, was sort of one of the reasons why American soldiers acted the way they did. So it wasn't so much racism per se, while that may have had an impact, but the personal events of soldiers throughout the Pacific War and certain battles may have been more prominent or may have caused these atrocities based on what they saw or what other soldiers saw and then word of mouth. And then John Dower also states something similar to that, as he also talks about the racial perceptions that actually caused the atrocities because of prior thoughts about the Japanese and all Asians for that matter. And then my methodology, or the way in which I'm going to structure my paper, most of my primary sources will include, or all of them really, will be diaries and memoirs from soldiers and officers from the 5 battles that I chose, which are the Philippines, New Guinea, Guadalcanal, Laylu, and Okinawa, and in that order. So I want to look at chronologically throughout the Pacific War to see if there's any correlations between the beginning of the Pacific War and the end, and see if there's any change in behavior between the soldiers, and not just, you can't just conclude that, oh, there was just racism throughout. I'm trying to see if there was any changes throughout the 3.5 years or so of the Pacific War. And the main reason why I want to look at this too is I want to look at the why and how of the soldiers, just as other historians have done about the Nazi soldiers, because I don't feel like the the Pacific War has really been looked at quite the way it has with Nazi soldiers. So the Philippines is the first sort of battle that I look at, and American soldiers entered the war with sort of preconceived notions about the way that they viewed the Pacific soldier or the Japanese soldiers. They saw them as inferiors, and a lot of even the generals and the higher-ranking officers actually sort of conveyed this to the soldiers. And I can't remember the name of the general right now, but he actually told his soldiers that they need to act a certain way towards the Japanese because they are quote-unquote vermin. And even prior and even throughout the Philippines, the Japanese were taken by the American soldiers as someone they could sort of trust in their word, which was the Japanese soldiers actually Japan dropped pamphlets addressed to General Jonathan Wainwright, and they actually explained sort of the structure of Bushido that urged honorable surrender and which needed to halt needless bloodshed. So the American soldiers actually trusted the word of the Japanese government that they would behave essentially because of the Geneva Convention. All of this was true. American soldiers later on actually questioned the intentions of the Japanese soldiers as the Philippine campaign drew to a close. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm looking at the Botanic Death March in particular as a catalyst for how the atrocities would later impact the Pacific War in terms of the American atrocities against the Japanese, starting with the Botanic Death March. And New Guinea, Guadalcanal, and Palelu I kind of look at together because a lot of them have a lot of similarities between exactly what happened. There was actually a journal entry that I found at a Marine on New Guinea that said that he saw a change in tactics and behavior of the American soldiers from the Philippines to New Guinea based on how the Japanese were fighting and how the Americans were fighting based on the environment and just the overall circumstances of the war. So they had to adapt to what they were actually seeing. One Japanese soldier actually killed a medic who was actually trying to help him too. So this is just one of those personal stories that sort of helps sort of continue the act of atrocities against the Japanese because they're seeing these actual acts right in front of them happen, and they're telling their friends about them, and they just absolutely hate the Japanese because of it. So it's not so much racism as you can kind of see maybe a little bit from just these couple examples about how the Japanese were actually treating the Americans. So it wasn't so much the Americans were treating the Japanese with disrespect and inhumanely. It was sort of the opposite, and the Americans were simply just sort of acting out against them. And another example was cannibalism that started sort of in New Guinea. And an additional example as well was a suicide message system, as I kind of call it. And it was actually Japanese soldiers would sort of place themselves, and wounded Japanese soldiers would place themselves sort of strategically throughout different areas in battle. And if they sort of spotted or heard American soldiers, they would commit suicide. And that sort of chain of events would trickle down to other soldiers that would then kill themselves to that way command, or the command post would then be known that American soldiers were sort of in the area. American soldiers had to react in a way to sort of combat that, and they would actually get behind the Japanese soldiers and slit their throats. And rather than trying to take prisoners, they just decided to kill them rather than risk their own lives and their friends or other soldiers. And then Okinawa was the last battle that I look at, and this took place right towards the end of World War II. This was like 1945. And one of the things I saw interesting was the implementation of psychological warfare, a program created by General Buckner. And this happened right at the beginning of the Okinawa campaign. And they would drop pamphlets that sort of wanted not only just the Japanese soldiers, but the civilians themselves to give up. And not in a way that would demoralize them, but they wanted to sort of convey to them that if you surrender to us, you will find peace, you can return home to your families, and you don't need to die because you're going to lose anyway. So there's no point in trying to kill yourselves or get the other soldiers killed as well. And just my final thoughts. My primary sources that I found point to circumstances and environment that drove American soldiers to commit atrocities against the Japanese soldiers out of mostly frustrations from the war. So it was in addition to what they had to deal with sort of emotionally, but it was also what they were seeing on a day-to-day basis from other soldiers and from themselves that sort of drove them to commit the atrocities. It wasn't so much racism, while that may have been in the back of their minds, and it was pushed by other generals and other higher-ranking officers and even by their own comrades, forcing them to do these things, but it was in fact smaller events, even just the Potomac March, that may have sort of pushed things over the edge for them, but it was mostly personal events that caused them to do these things. And that's it.
So our panelists are now going to take seats in front. You can ask questions.
Oh, let's
A
go.
bunch of questions. So, Dr. Fowler.
So thank you so much, guys, for a great panel. I thought it was really interesting how this panel really interrogated this idea of the America of the greatest generation, right? And really delved into looking at some of the uncomfortable sides of this period. And I thought also this panel raised this issue of historical comparison and how hard it is to come up with a productive comparison that leads to sort of a larger explanation for something. So I wanted to push two of you on your comparisons. For Patrick, I mean, it's so interesting because like we don't want to put FDR and Hitler in the same box, right? And you are, and I applaud you for that. But I wonder how specific political religion is, because it sounds a lot like mass politics or politics in an age of mass culture, right? And I'd like to throw out this Georgian seminary dropout. Soso Jugashvili, who became Joseph Stalin, right? And all of the categories that you put up there, I mean, you could use them for Stalin's Soviet Union as well, and he also brought them out of economic catastrophe, right? So what do you get by only having these two people, and what might change if you added more leaders from this period of this age of mass politics to your story? And for Chris, kind of similarly, I wonder too whether there's this larger story in your project of what World War II was like, right? It was a war of atrocity, right? No, everyone was committing atrocities, right? In both theaters of war, East and West. And you know, you made this comparison at the beginning to sort of the way the Nazi soldiers treated the Jews, and I wonder why you picked that comparison, because you're talking about this large non-combatant group, right? Versus your main part of your story, which was two armies, right? And I wonder if another comparison might be the Nazi and Red Army comparison, right? And the way that both of those armies were committing atrocities against each other. So kind of wanted to push you on that comparison. But thanks for a great panel.
You want me to go first, Chris? Take a stab at it. Thank you so much for the question. I love it. I did have a feeling that after comparing Hitler and FDR, that there would be some questions. And so I think, to answer your first question, I think that Hitler and FDR, maybe at basis, especially since we've lived, I don't know, I've lived in America all my life, I would say, how the heck could you compare FDR and a guy like that with all the differences? But I think I was trying to focus on the larger things that make them similar, which would then go to your second question is, okay, so why compare FDR and Hitler and not other leaders like, for instance, Stalin? And I actually think that what I'm trying to prove in this research is like, so political science background, there's a lot of theories that can sometimes be broad. And this one, yes, indeed, I would admit it's broad at its basis, but I only really touched on, I kind of gave a 1-minute summation of it, and I didn't even touch on books or articles, so I didn't really get too in-depth in it, but from what I said in my presentation, the general sense of it, then yes, I definitely think like Stalin and other leaders could definitely be case studies, and I would actually promote that because I think that would be very interesting.
thank you for the question as well. And I mainly picked the side of the Nazi soldiers against the Jews is just because it's the Holocaust. That's kind of what is known about World War II, at least from an American perspective, because that's what we kind of learned about in school growing up. And I wanted to look at that from the motivations, which is why I picked the American side as well. And I took a World War II class last semester with Dr. Kurlander, and I did a paper about sort of like motivations, but it was just sort of a general sort of outlook between ideologies and circumstances of the war. And I wanted to sort of incorporate that into the American side. Since I'm American, I've grown up an American, and I wanted to learn something more about it. And the only way I knew how to really compare that was against the Holocaust. So while the Russian side I think is very interesting as well, and I'll probably read that now that I have time. But
Awesome, thanks.
Right, good. So Dr. Sayed, then the student here, and then Dr. Ryder.
Okay, just some comments. Pat, I think maybe you need to be a bit more careful because about this political religion, that you want to be clear that the evidence points you to look at this theory rather than the other way around, that you got the theory first and you try to cram in the evidence to the theory, because that is a more poli-sci approach as opposed to a more historical approach. With regard to Shane's paper, you mentioned Roger Daniels, but you did not mention H.R. Azuma. And he is currently the leading historian of Japanese American history. And he's written about internment. And you might find his book, Between Two Empires. Have you read that book?
There are so many
Well,
books.
you could have read the book because it would have helped your argument. That's the latest caution. I know because I studied under him. So you might want to look at that. Well, I don't know whether you have time before you submit, but just a brief comment. Where he talks about one factor which he did mention is Japanese nationalism, and how that it's a fight between Japanese nationalism and American nationalism for the loyalties of many of these Nisei, the Japanese American, basically. So that's one factor which I noticed you didn't mention. For Chris, I think you left out Pearl Harbor. You mentioned a lot about the Bataan Death March, but Pearl Harbor, it's interesting because it's a sneak attack, and the Japanese have a history of sneak attacks. Like the previous one was the Russo-Japanese War, Togo, the fleet led by Admiral Togo. And the Japanese fleet which launched the raid on Pearl Harbor had the same naval flag that Togo used when he launched the attack of the Russians during the Russo-Japanese War. So there's a precedent for this, and that plays a lot on the psychology of it. Another thing is you mentioned John Dower. What I felt we could have done perhaps is John Dower, he has an agenda. He talks about racism in the war, because he's part of this new wave in Japanese historiography, which is presenting a new perspective as opposed to earlier scholarship in the history of basically among those historians working on Japan. So I thought we could have better contextualized it, to say that he has actually a political agenda, if you want to show that you disagree. So just some comments. Thank you. If you want to respond, that's
why
fine.
you have 5 more days.
This question is for Chris, and I was wondering if you know of any legislation or anything, obviously because you said that war is written by the victors, that means it's probable that even though that this is there is information on this and we do know that these things happen, that there's probably not any actual changes of government or any legislation or any changes between what happened then and how it is now. So is there any legislation that would pass between now and then based on the how our soldiers are to treat the enemies, or do we have the same legislation as then? Because if that's the case, if there's no new legislation or if there's no new any kind of implementation of rules, then does that mean that the soldiers that are today, are they going to be treating the enemies the same that they did then? And if not, then if so or if not, then how would, what is your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the biggest problem then was that those laws really weren't enforced, at least from what I read. There were no repercussions for what the soldiers were doing. There may have been small instances where it was reinforced, but I mean, you have the Geneva Convention, which was sort of ignored by the Japanese soldiers, obviously. That's sort of like the basis of my paper, but that's sort of what I'm talking about, at least for some of the examples. But I think now you have it more to where a lot of soldiers are scrutinized, and with the fact of social media, but just media in general, newspapers and journalists, back then you really couldn't police it and enforce it as much as, well, now. And even then, I mean, you still had soldiers that committed these things right in front of their superiors, and there was nothing really done. And if anything, the superiors sort of congratulated them for it, or at least didn't say anything at all.
So, Dr. Ryder?
I have a question for each one of you.
Yay.
Patrick,
Yes.
somewhere in my office, famous last words, I
Where is it?
have the funeral edition of the Philadelphia newspaper for FDR. A student gave it to me once. His grandmother had lovingly preserved it and used to talk about the FDR days. And so it's beautifully wrapped somewhere there. You'll find the strangest things in the corners of my office. In any case, the question I wanted to ask you is, this is not the only time this happens. For instance, when we see these elaborate funeral and obituary editions for JFK, we see this for the death of Reagan. We see this even for figures like Princess of Wales. Perhaps the question that I would frame from all of this is we're not so much looking at a political religion as the creation of a god posthumously. That perhaps there's a politics, but there is also a human nature to create these gods, these elaborate eulogies, these pictorial obituaries, of which FDR's was certainly one. What do you think?
Well, I think at first I started off, and I think my colleagues in my class would remember, I was going to compare Hitler and Reagan, and they looked at me and they said, "You're going to die." And so I did. So to start off, the reason why I picked, kind of answer the first part of it, FDR was the fact that they started at the same time and ended at the same time. That allowed for a lot of similarities and correlations to be drawn. But definitely, I think you make an excellent point that you're like, okay, well, was this anything really that special? I mean, JFK, Reagan. I would say, to conclude with what I would say for myself, is that FDR's situation is very specific. If you read anything about political religion, the theory in general, it's only talked about in totalitarian fascist states, really, of this time period. So I think that probably promotes the fact that anybody could really extend further.
Okay. Shane, one factor you didn't mention was economic. Case in point, if you go to, say, Washington State, Oregon even, and you talk to them about the Japanese internment, we always hear about the West Coast California internment. But if you go up to Oregon and Washington, it was particularly nasty. And oral historians have talked to the survivors of that period, and the feeling was that in many cases, the Japanese Americans owned some of the nicest land in that area agriculturally. And so internment was embraced up there because it was a way to economically make a transfer of the good farmland. If you go to Hawaii, well, you would think you would have one of the strongest internment policies. You don't. Because economically, the Japanese Americans were so vital to the running of that territory. In the Second World War, it would have been economic suicide to intern them. So you may want to go back and take a look at the economic policies as well that are going to govern even on the West Coast this issue. Chris, I noticed in the slide that we've got up right now, if we went one more back, you had some cartoons there from Shane, I believe. And I believe that one down there in the corner is Theodore Geisel, the one that shows what are you doing to save your country today? And many of you probably know Theodore Geisel under a different name. This is Dr. Seuss. You may not have known that he was a major political cartoonist in the early parts of World War II. The point that I'm making here is something that Dr. Siak started to bring up. When Geisel, yeah, down there in the other corner, what have you done today? I think that is a Geisel cartoon.
Yeah.
The reason that I bring that up is because Geisel was a terrible racist when it came to the Japanese. And he always portrayed them as cats, being so ultra sneaky, that everything they did was a sneak attack. And I'm wondering whether indeed that played into the American perception of the Japanese out in the field. What do you think?
I mean, you can't say that racism didn't play a major role in the atrocities, but I think it's a matter of, at least in the primary sources I found, there was nothing that really said, oh, we hate the Japanese, we're going to kill them. It was, oh, I saw what they did to so-and-so, or what they tried to do to me, and I hate them now. So, I mean, I'm sure that they probably, in their minds, they knew they hated the Japanese, but it wasn't like they acted out, at least from what I saw. It wasn't like racism caused the atrocities, or was the result of the atrocities, or, yeah, caused them. And then, maybe this a little better. I mean, did I answer your question?
That's
or?
fine. I mean, just
Okay.
as a side note, I had a great uncle who was a survivor of Bataan. And he would never, ever, ever talk about that or his reactions, because he was actually ashamed. Not so much because he thought it was racist, but because it hurt the people at Peleliu and Pearl Harbor and Bataan so much that they weren't thinking in terms of racism. They were simply thinking in terms of a numbness of striking back to something that was too horrific for them to deal with any other way. So, okay, thanks.
I want to give Shane a chance to respond, because he's got a bunch of comments and he hasn't had a chance to respond. And then last question, Dr. Vieras, and we'll take our break. So, all right, go ahead.
I guess the biggest one was the Japanese nationalism posed by Dr. Saya. That did come up in a lot of my sources, the whole idea of competing over Japanese nationalism. Specifically, like when it goes all the way back to in the internment camps, before they were able to enter the become part of the U.S. military, they had to fill out this form where that renounced any loyalty to the emperor, and so on and so forth, which was a major problematic question that we discussed in one of Dr. Muir's classes previously. However, the reason why I didn't really touch on it too much was because, as it showed in the internment camps, was most of the Japanese Americans had already grown up. They were like Niseis, with their second generation, so on and so forth. So they didn't ever really have any loyalties back to Japan. It was more like a distant memory. And so it seemed like it would be more problematic in trying to engage with that. For those that were first generation and so on, of course, it has more application. So I might go back and touch on it a little bit just to further explain the roles behind it.
But that's not what the latest scholarship necessarily says. So Roger Daniels is dated stuff, outdated stuff. So what you read?
So during the break, take notes from Dr. Zaya. Good. Thank you for responding. Dr. Muirez.
Hey, so those are all really interesting, presentations, y'all. Thanks. These might be more comments than questions, although you can certainly talk about them if you want. I think, I guess I was thinking more about Chris's presentation with this comment, but it seems like actually both you and Shane are sort of struggling with this issue of the role of race and how to emphasize the way race and racism play into these larger events. And I guess I just want to suggest a way of thinking about it that maybe is a little bit more subtle, that in terms of how one group of people perceives another, there are these understandings of difference and otherness that might underlie acts or policies or reactions to events that might not always be vocalized, right? And so even in a context like this extremely brutal war, and Dr. Fowler alluded to this earlier, it might be possible to find ways in which people on both of those sides have this sort of added way of understanding the other that is inflected by perceptions of racial difference that therefore affect the kind of acts they perpetrate on one another. The parallels I'm thinking of right now, just because of what I've been teaching, have more to do with warfare between Europeans and Native Americans in colonial America, where you see a lot of that kind of sort of underlying set of assumptions about savagery and civilization. And I think that's certainly what played in for Americans with the Japanese. Possibly there are some of the same kinds of perceptions of racial ethnic difference with Germans and Russians. I don't really know this, but I'm thinking that might be true. And so there might be a way of thinking about that, it's not so much that the racism is sort of there front and center, and this might in some way play into what you're talking about, Shane, as well. I mean, I appreciate the way you all are trying to put together very complex answers to these questions, but I think that's usually true, that there's not just one answer, right? There's sort of multiple answers. And then I also had a really quick comment for Patrick. Kudos to you for a sort of provocative way of starting out your paper. I guess I thought it would be interesting to think about this idea of political religion and how it played out differently for each of the leaders, very obviously, right? Too obvious to even really require discussion, but why is that, right? Why is if FDR is indeed an example of this kind of political religion at work, what is it about the American context that, made his trajectory very different? And I mean, that also gets into some of the other parallels that historians have sometimes looked at with the United States, pre-World War II, ideas, eugenic ideas, things like that. Why did that all play out in a certain way in the U.S., but in a very different way in Europe? And so something to think about there, and maybe think more about how to apply that argument about political religion and put it differently.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to take a very brief break, 4 minutes, and food if you're